Support for this episode comes from Gvoke HypoPen. Most people who take insulin have experienced low blood sugar. It can be disorienting and scary. Very low blood sugar is very scary. And that's where Gvoke HypoPen comes in. Gvoke HypoPen is a ready-to-use rescue pen for treating very low blood sugar in people with diabetes ages 2 and above. If you take insulin or sulfonylureas, you are at risk for your blood sugar going too low. Low blood sugar emergencies can happen unexpectedly, and they demand quick action. You need a safety net when it matters most. Be ready to treat very low blood sugar with Gvoke HypoPen. Go to diabetes-connections.com and click on the Gvoke logo. Gvoke shouldn't be used if you have a tumor in the gland on top of your kidneys called pheochromocytoma, or if you have a tumor in your pancreas called insulinoma. Visit gvokeglucagon.com/risk for safety information.
This is Diabetes Connections with Stacey Sims.
This week, Scott Strumello has lived almost 50 years with type 1. Diagnosed as a child in the 70s, he found the online community as an adult and started blogging. Scott has a unique perspective with a background in finance and consulting. He's a great source of what's happening in earnings calls, legislation, and the business of diabetes. We have a great talk about what's coming in terms of biosimilars, the role of PBMs, and some legal action that may happen this year. This podcast is not intended as medical advice. If you have those kinds of questions, please contact your healthcare provider. Welcome to another week of the show. I'm always so glad to have you here. You know we aim to educate and inspire about diabetes with a focus on people who use insulin. I'm your host, Stacey Sims, and a couple of quick things before we start the interview. First, I am exhausted. I have been going nonstop for a while now, and it is not going to stop anytime soon. I always think that summer is going to be slower. And of course, there are conferences and people are trying to cram so much in, and my kids have all this stuff going on. So I'm just trying to catch my breath. I'm sure you're just as busy. Oh my goodness. One of the things that's going on is a webinar that I am taking part in. I am speaking. It's tonight, actually, as this episode goes live. It is June 18th. Tonight, I am working with the Breakthrough T1D Mountain West chapter, and we're talking about making diabetes connections, finding local support, stuff to help your family thrive with T1D that isn't all social media based. That kicks off tonight at 6 p.m. Mountain, which is 8 p.m. Eastern time. I'm really excited to be working with that chapter. Of course, we are bringing Mom's Night Out to the Denver area in September. I'm also bringing Mom's Night Out to Philadelphia in October. Our early bird registration is live for both of those events. You can learn more. Just go to diabetes-connections.com, click on the Mom's Night Out page. And if you have time to attend the webinar, if it's not too late, I will put a link in the show notes. You have to register first, but you can register just before it begins. It's usually pretty easy to do that. It's just to get the Zoom link. And later this week, like lots and lots of people in the diabetes space, I am heading down to Orlando for American Diabetes Association's scientific sessions. We are going to try to pack in as much as possible into those couple of days, just learning about the latest stuff, bringing back stories for you, talking to partners for these events that I'm doing, and trying not to melt in the Orlando heat. If you have specific ideas of what you'd like me to cover, feel free to shoot me an email, Stacey@diabetes-connections.com, or post in the Facebook group. More than happy to try to talk to the people that you want to hear from. I already have interviews scheduled with a couple of the usual suspects, but I'm hoping to bring some new voices to the show. All right. I have been reading Scott Strumello's blog and social media posts for years. I can't believe it took me all this time to have him on the podcast. I am going to link up his blog. It is an excellent source for the intersection of diabetes and pharmaceutical business and a lot more. But not a lot of places follow the industry as closely as Scott. And he is not afraid to tell you what he thinks about the news. My conversation with him right after this. Diabetes doesn't always have to interrupt your day. Dexcom G7, a continuous glucose monitoring system, sends your glucose numbers to your phone or receiver. Know where you are and where you're headed without finger sticks and without interruptions. Dexcom G7 is the most accurate CGM, and it's covered by Medicare. Learn more, go to diabetes-connections.com and click on the Dexcom logo. Finger sticks required if symptoms or expectations do not match readings. See user guide for instructions. Data on file must meet coverage criteria. For full prescribing information on risks and benefits, visit Dexcom.com. Scott Strumello, welcome to Diabetes Connections. It's great to finally talk to you. I've been reading you for years. Welcome.
Thank you. And it's great to meet you face to face,
Yeah,
virtually anyway.
exactly. I love it. I have so much to talk to you about. Your blog is just an incredible source of information, and we're going to focus on insulin and PBMs. But let me get your story first. You've lived with type 1 for a long time. You were diagnosed as a little kid, right?
Yeah. In fact, I have to do the math on the calculator now, but I was diagnosed at age 7 in 1976, in like August of 1976. So bottom line, 2026 I'll be eligible for my Joslin Half Century Medal.
Wow.
If I choose to claim it. I'm still debating on that. So.
Oh, all right. Well, I have to ask why. I don't want to derail us before we get started, but I have to ask why.
I sort of, I go back and forth, yes, it's nice, but doesn't really do anything for you. It's just another piece of merchandise collecting dust, I guess. But also, I guess the other thing is that right now there are so many of us that are approaching this. Once upon a time, it was a rarity. I think there's several thousand of us that are going to be going into this category. So I'm not sure it's all that special anymore.
So interesting. Well, I'll just say from a community standpoint, the Joslin Medalist study is really valuable if you're willing to take part in that. But I hear you. It's not, when Benny was diagnosed in 2006, we'd hear about these medalists and think, oh my gosh, 50 years, they made it. And now, thank God, it's so much more common.
Yeah.
So hey, keep us posted on what you do. It's a great milestone no matter what.
I go back and forth, so,
But you weren't the first person in your family, right? Your sister had been diagnosed with type 1.
She is, and she is 4 years ahead of me. She was diagnosed at age 4, the year I was born. So by the time I had it, my parents were like, no big deal, but yeah, so she's probably already past her 50-year threshold. I don't know that she has any interest in medalists or anything like that. And one of the things I've run into is that although my doctors know it's like 50 years, coming up with proof of that is like a real, there's no hospital records anymore. A lot of them were deleted. And so you have to get, for Joslin, you have to get attestation from people, which is easy enough to do. But it's kind of amazing when you think about it, because now we're so used to everything digital. But in those days, they were like paper archives, and they kept them for 20 years and then they tossed them. So It's just where we are today and where we've come from.
Yeah, it's amazing to think about. Recently, I asked our endocrinologist for Benny's A1Cs over his lifetime, because I just wanted to look at, I forget, when he was 2 years old to 9 years old, I don't know what the heck it was. And they were like, oh, here you go. It's amazing. And it's a great point, because just 10 years prior, it would not have been on a computer. It would have been on a piece of paper somewhere.
Yeah. And, to that point, I'm old enough to remember when the A1C was new, I mean, so.
Well, I wanted to ask you about, 2 kids growing up in the 70s and 80s with type 1 before home blood glucose meters.
Yeah.
What do you remember about that time specifically for type 1? I mean, I know you were peeing in the vials and they were turning colors.
Here's where having an older sibling can be good and bad. I'm not saying it, but my sister taught me a trick, and she's like, just put an extra drop or two of water, and it's blue and not, or it's green, not orange. Because you used to put little drops in a vial and it would boil. And so she was the one that taught me how to cheat on the numbers back then.
Hysterical.
But, as a kid, you're more interested in, I want dessert now. I don't want to wait 3 hours for it. It's like.
No doubt. I still can't believe kids today haven't figured out how to hack the share. So it always shows that you're at 120.
There's actually some utility in that. So if you're out there and you're thinking about it, to give you an example, the new Dexcom Stello is the exact same sensor as the Dexcom G7, but the software that it works with is totally different. But the thing is, you could potentially, if you could hack your way into that, you could use the cheap OTC Dexcom Stello with all the alarms and stuff. So, I mean, there are some interesting possibilities that for someone who's tech savvy and motivated, it would be really fascinating to see it happen.
I told Jake Leach from Dexcom that that was going to happen during our Stellar interview, and he was like, no comment. He knows how creative the community is. But if you've got an OTC, if you've got an over-the-counter, basically G7.
Yeah.
First of all, it would have saved me a lot of headache this morning when I'm trying to get my son a transmitter in Fairfax, Virginia. That's another story altogether, sending that through the mail. Scott, so I don't want to fast forward through your entire story, but you grew up with type 1. How did you find your way to blogging? Because you're one of the first diabetes bloggers I remember finding.
Yeah, it was sort of, I can't even, I'd have to go back and look at my notes for the date, but I think it was around like 2004 or 5, something like that. I discovered, or I had read a book, actually, the Deb Butterfield memoir, Showdown with Diabetes. And after she published that book, she started an online community, which was known as Diabetes Portal. And she had weekly chats with diabetes luminaries of the time. She had a whole library of published articles. Anyway, long story short, Deb adopted 2 kids and decided the time was right to shut the diabetes portal and those activities down. And it was kind of a casual suggestion, but she said, you might want to think about starting your own blog. And so that's kind of how I started getting into that. And then around the same time, there were a whole bunch of us that had kind of the same idea. People like Carrie Marone Sparling, Scott K. Johnson, David Edelman. His wife at the time was diagnosed with type 1, Manny Hernandez. So there were like all these people who someday, will be kind of an afterthought, but there were a lot of us out there. And so one of the tools David Edelman from Diabetes Daily had come up with was an API that you could share diabetes blog posts. And so everyone kind of knew when somebody had written something new, and it was kind of a nice tool. That's kind of how it started, I guess. Many of us were lucky enough to have been invited to some of these industry-sponsored events. The first one was Roche, and then Medtronic had one. And the first time we had all met each other face to face. So those events were really kind of stunning. And, we all knew everybody's story. So that was it.
What made you go toward more of the business side? I mean, it's not the only thing you blogged about, but certainly over time, you've become a real reliable source on digging into and kind of peeling back the layers of industry, money, not investing so much, but, money, cost, that sort of thing.
Yeah. Well, part of the issue was that at the time, everything that we as a patient community were hearing about had been vetted through someone else. And I was like, wait a minute, these are all publicly held companies. I could probably just listen to their investor, read through their SEC filings and listen to their investor presentations and learn stuff that the ADA or JDRF isn't sharing with us. And lo and behold, it was like a whole treasure trove of stuff. It was really amazing. So I did it for like a lot of these companies. Most of them were publicly held, traded on the NASDAQ or, the New York Stock Exchange or something. So the information was out there. It's just somebody had to mine it. I took a lot of interest and also pleasure in kind of discovering things that nobody else was telling us about. So
is your background in finance? Is it, and you don't have to answer if I'm too personal, but I'm curious about that. I know you're not a journalist, but at the same time, you're good. You're a great digger, Scott.
I like to write, and sometimes I'm a little too verbose. And so that's where I'm finding AI tools are really helpful for editing stuff down. That's a side note. But in terms of, I had worked in, on the corporate side of retail banking. I was the marketing guy for such companies as Household Credit Services. I launched the GM card, for example. And then I stayed in retail banking. I worked for Wells Fargo for a few years. So also in the marketing side of things. And then I kind of took a detour and I took a job for a boutique management consulting firm, which specialized in credit cards and debit cards and all that kind of stuff. So that's kind of my background. I guess it's the consulting side of me, because in consulting, I had a lot of great latitude to do deep dives into what companies were doing. And I just took the same skill set and applied it to diabetes. And that's kind of how I got into the space.
All right, let's talk about like what's on your mind these days. You've done a really nice job recently of writing up some information on PBMs and insulin, which despite the Biden administration progress for people on Medicare, continues to be a huge issue. I can't do a huge deep dive with you today, but give me some of the high spots. What should people be aware of? Right back to our conversation. But first, Diabetes Connections is brought to you by Omnipod. For many of you, as you listen, this is going to sound like a weird question. Why do you use the insulin pump you've got on right now? There's a really good chance that you went on that pump 15 or 20 years ago because it's what your doctor had back then, and you've never really thought about changing. That was us until Benny's Pump Company went out of business, and I was amazed how much things had changed when we looked for a new one. I'm telling you, it is time to take advantage of what's new. If you need a sign to switch, this is it. Omnipod 5. The tubeless automated insulin delivery system is here, and it's available through the pharmacy, which means that you can try it today, even if your tubed pump is under warranty. Fill out the quick online form, see if you're eligible for a free trial. Go to diabetes-connections.com, click on the Omnipod logo. For full safety risk information and free trial terms and conditions, visit omnipod.com/diabetesconnections.
I did a white paper that I basically sent out gratis to a whole bunch of biosimilar manufacturers. And by the way, there are a whole bunch of those coming. They're all currently pending FDA approval decisions as we speak. Some have gotten complete response letters from the FDA that say we needed to fix this, this, and this before we will reconsider it. But the bottom line is a whole bunch of biosimilars are coming. So,
and Scott, I don't mean to interrupt, but when you say biosimilars, are we talking for Humalog, Novolog, Levemir, Lantus? Like what kinds of insulins?
Basically, the biosimilar manufacturers are following the money. So they're going after the best sellers. Those numbers are kind of not necessarily indicative of what a patient's want or need, because the sales numbers are really driven by formulary placement, which are not medical decisions. Those are decisions made by suit in the insurance companies. In terms of what biosimilars are coming, we know that there are a whole bunch of Lantus biosimilars. In addition to the 2 or 3 that are already on the market, there are like another 4 or 5 of that one coming, because that's the single best-selling insulin on the market, and it's lost patent exclusivity. There are a whole bunch, almost as many of Novolog or insulin aspart. There are fewer of insulin Lispro, which is Lilly's Humalog. Part of the reason is because Lilly has been so aggressive in cutting prices on that product that the economics are not as good. But interestingly, there are 2 others that I think people may be surprised to hear. Amphastar Pharmaceuticals has, in addition to those, they have a couple of regular human insulins coming. At first, I thought it was going to be just like U100 regular, 100 units per milliliter. And that is coming, but there's also a U500 version of that, which I think they're expecting to be their best seller, because Lilly is the only provider of that particular product. That targets mainly the type 2 audience. So that's coming. And interestingly, their most recent investor presentation also said they had one for insulin degludec, which is known as the brand name of Tresiba. That product still has patent protection until, in the US anyway, until 2032. But keep in mind that other countries have different patent expiration dates. So, and they also can sell the active pharmaceutical ingredient to other companies. So
it's so interesting. So, and maybe I should have defined this first, but when we talk about biosimilars, this is so different from saying generics, right? Like it's a weird, maybe it's not. Scott made a face. I know you can't see that, but when I said generics, he made a face. So before I finish my question, tell me about the face, Scott. What, it's so confusing to say biosimilar generics.
So here's the thing. Insulin is kind of an atypical medication in that it was the first ever biologic medicine to hit the market. But because there were no regulations in place at the time, it was governed as a drug under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act. And that kind of delayed the advent of biosimilars in the first place because there was no law that explicitly legalized them until the Affordable Care Act of 2010 went into law. And then, because it was approved as a drug, FDA had to implement some policies that said that biologics that were originally approved as drug are hereby recognized as biologics that are eligible for biosimilars as outlined under the Biologics Act. So it was like kind of a whole convoluted process. But back, I don't even remember when I wrote it, but I wrote an original article about why we had no generic insulin years ago. And the question in my mind was, these are off-patent products. And all of a sudden we're hearing about all these, lower cost generics, and we don't have any for insulin. What gives? A whole long story on that. But the bottom line is they're coming now, and they're coming in a pretty big way. And so I think it's possible that we will see more and more of these in the coming years. Personally, I have concerns that Lilly and Novo Nordisk and Sanofi may decide, you know what, the insulin business is too commoditized. We want to exit completely and let biosimilars deal with it. But what about new innovation? Where's that going to come from?
Yeah.
So
years ago, it is years ago now. I think it was in 2020 when I was talking to Lilly about COVID and some of their coupons. And they were also talking about the faster acting insulins that were going to be introduced. And I think possibly prompted by one of your blogs, I asked them, well, what's to keep you from getting out of the regular insulin business? Lowercase regular, insulin, as you said, Lispro and Aspart. What's to keep you from getting out of that business and just trying to make money on these newer insulins? And they kind of laughed like, we will never do that. We're here for patients. You're talking to a public relations person. I'm not even talking to the higher ups, and they wouldn't tell you anyway. But there's in the back of a lot of people's minds, there's this fear that not only, it was Fiasp and other insulins like that, Lumjev, that we were talking about back in the day. Now it's GLP-1s and Ozempic and Mounjaro. Why would they stay in the insulin business when they can make billions over these drugs?
And we're already seeing it to some extent. Novo Nordisk, for example, in November 2023 announced that they were pulling the plug on Levemir, insulin detamir, and they were going to do it much quicker than they had discontinued insulins in the past. In the past, they always retired. Once they were no longer patent protected, they'd make slight tweaks and have a new and improved product. And that's what they've done with Fiasp and Novolog. Fiasp is the acronym for faster insulin aspart. They added some vitamin B3 or B6
I can't believe
or
I
something.
never put that together.
Yeah, it took me a long time too. Yeah. So anyway, but I suspect because there are so many biosimilars of Aspart in particular that are coming, Novo may just decide we're no longer making it. Let the biosimilars tear each other apart on price, and we'll focus exclusively on Fiasp. They haven't done it yet, but what's interesting though is about the insulins. And a couple of years ago, back in like 2017, when everyone was complaining about runaway insulin prices, that whole story is really convoluted. But the response from originally it was Lilly, and they said, why don't we just sell a cheaper version of Humalog that bypasses all these markups from the pharmacy benefit managers, doesn't have these multi-million-dollar rebate kickbacks. And originally they said it was going to be half price. But savvy patients really quickly discovered that with like a GoodRx coupon, they could get it for like 75% off. And lo and behold, the prices were comparable to what insurance company PBMs were paying for the same medicine. And then a couple years after Lilly did that, they casually, in an investor presentation, told investors that, nearly 1/3 of domestic Humalog sales were the cheaper unbranded version. And so I think that gave them a little bit of fortitude to say, you know what, we don't need the PBMs anymore. We can just sell this. And that works fine for us. So they've been very aggressive in cutting prices, which patients have benefited from. But, it's still kind of a convoluted way to do it. In other words, you have a brand name product and you're selling it under the generic name, and all of them do it. Novo Nordisk has two. They have one for Aspart and they have one for Degludec. And also Sanofi via its Winthrop unit has one for Lantus. And those aren't real biosimilars because they're made by the innovator. They're the exact same assembly line. It's just a different label on the package.
That's a great point. And I point this out. I have a large parent group in the Charlotte area. And every week somebody's getting a prescription for what looks like generic insulin. And they're like, what is this? And it's like, dude, it's the same thing. It's on the same assembly. They're slapping a different label on it. That's all it is. And it's unbelievable. It sounds unbelievable because that's not how most healthcare works, but it's the way they've done it.
Yeah. I mean, the good news is it works.
Right.
It was able to enable patients to get prices, insulin at prices comparable to what they pay in Canada and Europe. So they don't offer every product, they don't offer every insulin as an unbranded version. And clearly, I think pharmaceutical companies see GLP-1s as where the revenue is coming from. And that's where their focus is these days. Because they got a label extension a few years ago, I think around 2017, for the GLP to be prescribed as a weight loss drug for obesity without type 2 diabetes. And that opened the floodgates for them to be able to prescribe these to anybody, really anybody that wants to lose a few pounds and hopefully create a lifelong customer in the process.
I'm going to have to table that because that's going to be a whole other. I mean, really, and the supply, right? Certainly supplies of these drugs is very difficult for whether you're using them for weight loss or diabetes. It's tough right now.
The good news is biosimilars of those are coming along with insulin. All of the companies who have insulin biosimilars also have liraglutide, which was formerly known as Novo Nordisk. I get the names. Victoza was the type 2 drug, and then I can't remember what they called the weight loss drug, but they're the exact same thing. And those are all coming and with expected FDA approval decisions sometime in 2024. So
does that include things like Wegovy and Zepbound, like the tirzepatide and the semaglutide for that?
Those are the newest and new and improved versions of those products. Liraglutide, which was Victoza, and I can't remember what the weight loss version of that drug. So those are the ones that are coming. There are some, they're not as good in terms of maybe the weight loss isn't as good on those, or maybe you have to dose it multiple times a day, whereas they tend to be longer acting, the newer ones. So, and people don't like to inject themselves. So if you have to do it 5 times versus 1 time, guess which one people are going to pick? Unless you're paying $10,000 a year for it, in which case maybe a prick isn't so bad.
Is it Saxenda? Is that the one?
Saxenda, yes. Okay. I think that is, yeah.
Okay. Before we get down the whole different, the different path of those drugs, when we talked about insulin biosimilars, you were talking about PBMs. Can you spend just a minute? I think we all think we know what PBMs are and the role that they play, but could you just, I know asking you to can you explain PBMs? This is a book. This is not a 10-minute podcast interview. But, what should people know about them and what's changing, if anything?
So PBMs are, the shortest way to say it is they're middle entities involved in the drug distribution system. When they began in the late 60s, early 70s, they were paper pushers. They submitted claims on behalf of the pharmacy to all those different insurance companies, and there were many more back in those days, to make sure that the pharmacies got reimbursed for those medicines. They very quickly automated it by computers when that became a thing. So that's kind of their original role was paper pushers. But along the way, they kind of morphed their own business objectives. And they said, we're negotiating on behalf of, let's say, 20 million people. Why don't we go to the drug companies and say, we're representing the interest of 20,000 covered patients. We think we should get a bigger discount than you're offering us. And so that was a very effective tool. The problem is that the way they get those discounts is in the form of rebates. And rebates have ballooned over the years. The last official number I had, and it was an estimate, but it was like $250 billion a year collectively on all drugs. But that's an awful lot of money. And so what happened was they kind of said, you know what, we're not really we don't have a fiduciary responsibility to anyone other than the insurance companies who now own all of the large big three PBMs. And so they focused primarily on rebate aggregation, often at the expense of what was the most cost-effective medicines. So they picked the more expensive drug that offered them the bigger rebate as opposed to the cheaper generic. And so that's kind of what their focus has been now. And especially since they are now integrated, Aetna, CVS Caremark, United Healthcare Optum Rx, and Cigna Express Scripts, their bottom line is the same as the insurance companies. And they see it as like money tree.
Yeah.
But,
yeah. But the FTC is looking at this right now, right? I mean, there's some, I don't want to say some hope. I mean, obviously, if you work at one of these companies or you're high up, you're like, well, this is fine. There's no problem here. But let me put it a different way. The FTC is looking into this. So we could see changes, right?
Yeah, I think it's very likely. I can't even remember, what was it, like 2022 or 2023, the Federal Trade Commission stepped in and said, we're going to undertake a comprehensive 6B study, is what they call it, on the vertically integrated pharmacy benefit managers, vertically integrated with commercial healthcare insurance companies. So they were focusing on like the top 6 or so who also happen to be owned or controlled by, as a de facto business unit of the insurance companies, even if they're not actually owned by them. And so they initiated this process, and the FTC is the only organization in the federal government which has the ability to subpoena without a law enforcement intent. And so when FTC sends out their request for information, it's not really a request, it's a subpoena. And the courts will say, if you don't comply, you can be held liable and, you may be subject to multi-million-dollar fines. But nevertheless, a couple weeks ago, FTC Chair Lina Khan had told the news that the PBMs have not fully complied with their subpoenas.
I am shocked, Scott. I'm so shocked.
So I don't know what's next. I mean, I think realistically, FTC probably is going to take them to court.
Yeah.
Say, you owe us this stuff and you've had 3 years and you haven't done it. Fine them until they get it to us. That could realistically happen, but it means a delay until the study is finished. I think, however, they probably have already reached a number of conclusions just based on the information they already have. So we'll see where that happens. I would like it to be wrapped up soon, but it's anyone's guess at this point when it's going to be done. I actually reached out to FTC Chair Lina Khan in an email about 2 years ago. I outlined kind of how insulin had already been sort of resolved in spite of FTC, but that the PBMs had already moved on from insulin rebate aggregation to CGM rebate aggregation instead. Okay, well, we'll just collect rebates on something else was basically what they decided to do. And it's not just diabetes, it's every medical condition with a medicine or medical device, so it's really important that this thing happen. But I think when it finally concludes, I think there's pretty clear evidence that they will find that the PBMs are in violation of no fewer than 5 or 6 laws. They will sue, and it probably will be turned over to the U.S. Department of Justice because they're basically going to, I think what they'll do is they'll say to CVS Health, which owns Aetna and Caremark, they'll say, you need to pick. Keep your PBM, keep your insurance company, but you can't have both. And they'll do the same thing for United Healthcare and Optum Rx. Pick one. Yeah. We don't care which one you do, but you'll have to pick one. And the same thing with Cigna and Express Scripts. So that could be the outcome. I'm speculating here, but I think it will get to litigation at some point when the study concludes. And then we could see a situation where, similar to what happened in the early 80s when the FTC sued and the Department of Justice sued AT&T and broke that up into a bunch of little pieces. So it's happened before and it could happen again.
That's interesting. Yeah, the baby bells. We could see the baby CVSs.
Yeah.
It doesn't roll off the tongue the same way. We'll have to work on that.
Yeah.
Scott, before I let you go, how are you doing these days? Do you mind sharing how you manage diabetes or anything that you don't have to, but whatever you'd like to share?
I like other people my age because, I will soon be a Jocelyn half-century medalist. um, the thing is, diabetes, anybody who's had it for any duration of time knows it never stays the same. It changes, it morphs, it evolves. And that's one of the challenges of managing it on an ongoing basis. And so I don't have the same issues I used to, but, there are new, different issues that you just respond, you deal with them. You don't jump to rash conclusions. You just, one day is not a trend, but 3 days might be, those kind of things. And you kind of make adjustments as necessary. So we'll see. I can't say things have changed materially. I still am in reasonably good health. I have no complaints on that issue. It's just I wish I didn't have to do it. And I keep saying, when's the 5-year thing going to happen?
When's that cure coming?
Yeah.
I'm curious, just to kind of go back to the beginning on this, how I found you. Are you glad you started blogging? Do you feel like that was a good decision for you?
It has been. It has been more just not necessarily because I don't know if anyone actually reads it. Obviously they do, but for me, it was a way to get things off of my mind that, were in there. And, when you put them down on paper or on electronic format somehow, then you don't need to worry about it anymore. You can kind of get it off your mind and move on to other things. So for me, it was very therapeutic just because of the impact it had on my mental state of being. Am I glad I did it? Yes. And also beyond that, I met a whole bunch of people who were living a very similar story. And I consider some of those, cherished friends. We've lost a couple over the years, which is sad, but my life has been enriched because I met all these people. So
that's great. Yeah, that's how I feel about blogging. I did it for myself. I mean, truly, no one read my blog, Scott, and I'm fine with that. I did because I was never personal enough because it wasn't my story. It was my son's, and I wasn't willing to share a lot of information about him. And so that's not cool for a mom blog. I'm like, I'm not going to tell you anything, but you should read this. Why?
No, I hear you. And, like I said, for me, it wasn't the fact that I gained 3 million followers. It was just getting it off my mind and expunging the thoughts that I had with it. So
it's so important.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining me, for sharing so much great information. I cannot believe it took me so long to have you on the show, and I hope to have you back much sooner because these are issues that are not going anywhere. Scott, thanks for being here.
Thank you. It was a pleasure, and hopefully we'll speak again.
You're listening to Diabetes Connections with Stacey Sims.
I will link up more information about Scott and, of course, his blog over at diabetes-connections.com. We have been having some weird website issues, so thank you for everybody who reached out about that. I don't know. My podcast hosting service, Liberated Syndication, or Libsyn as they go by, they changed, this is a little bit too much inside baseball, but they changed their WordPress plugin, and that caused a lot of chaos. We're still cleaning up. I am actually considering changing podcast hosts at the moment, not just because of that. There's some more stuff going on behind the scenes. So if you click over to the website, it should be okay. My fabulous web guru, Cindy, has been working her tail off to make sure it looks good and sounds good. But a lot of the players are broken or missing. So I'm really proud of our robust search. I think it's really easy to navigate our website and find the 650 episodes that we've done to find specific topics. But sometimes you're pulling up episodes and the player's not there. So your best bet right now, I hate to say, is a podcast player like Apple Podcasts or Spotify. We are on every single one of those, and we are working on the website, though. So thank you very much for your patience. Okay, I am off to ADA later this week, and I'll try to report as much as I can from there. Watch the socials. I'm on Instagram and Facebook And Threads, I am not really posting regularly on Twitter anymore, and I am not on TikTok at all. Thanks to my editor, John Buchanan from Audio Editing Solutions. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Stacey Sims. I'll see you back here soon. Until then, be kind to yourself.
Diabetes Connections is a production of Stacey Sims Media. All rights reserved, all wrongs avenged.
As you're managing life with diabetes, EdgePark is here to support you on your health journey. Discover convenience and peace of mind with EdgePark, your trusted supplier in diabetes management supplies. EdgePark has a wide variety of pump and CGM solutions from top brands to fit your unique needs. Plus, EdgePark works with most insurance companies and handles the paperwork to navigate insurance complexities for you and make the ordering process as seamless as possible. You work hard to manage your diabetes. Let EdgePark take care of the rest. Go to diabetes-connections.com and click on the EdgePark logo.